Cold clay. This first thing he feels. His face is pressed into the wet ground, and his mouth is stuffed mud with a hint of iron. A downpour pours down my back, just as if someone is tipping over buckets. He coughs. He rolls over, opens his eyes, and sees the sky whose is should exist. 2 moons, one huge and white, the second is smaller and reddish as dried blood. Stars so many that they blend into a single canvas. This is not California. This is Earth. Daniel Hunter is landing in the dirt and tries to remember the last thing happened before this. The substation. Night shift. Disconnector. 12 kilovolts in chest. He must be dead. But the mud under his fingers is real. The rain is real. The pain in ribs is real. He feels himself. Blue jacket with the words PG and E Field Services on the site. Multimeter on in pocket. Cell phone in back pocket is as a brick. Screen doesn't responding. Dan shakes it and realizes that the battery isn't just dead. It burned out from the inside. He puts away his phone back and looks back. The bank of the river, a wide and murky. The current fast and powerful. Engineering part of his brain automatically notices the speed of and the width of the channel. Kilowatts. Tens of kilowatts in potential. It pulls himself. Not now. In the distance, a bell. Not electric. Cast. Heavy. Such he had only in the museum in San Francisco. The smell sweeps over in a wave. Smoke. Manure. Wet straw. Goats are bleeding somewhere. Dan gets to his feet. He's unsteady. He takes 3 steps and nearly falls back into the mud. His legs won't hold him. His body feels as if an electric current has passed through it, which, in fact, is exactly what happened. He stands on the bank of an unknown river beneath 2 moons and makes a list. First, a dry place. Second, a hot meal. Third, figure out where he's ended up. The engineer in him doesn't panic. The engineer in him gets to work. Splashing through puddles, he turns his head and sees a silhouette. A girl in a long cloak is walking along the bank. She's holding an oil lantern. It's smoking. It's belching soot. It barely illuminates a 2-meter radius around it. The flame flickers behind the cloudy glass and is about to go out. Dan looks at this pitiful little flame and, for the first time all evening, feels something other than horror. Professional curiosity. The wick is cut crookedly. The oil is clearly poor quality. There's no reflector at all. This thing's efficiency is 3% at best. He almost smiles. There's 10 years' worth of work here. The girl notices him and stops. The lantern trembles in her hand. She says something in a language he doesn't understand. Sharp, guttural sounds. But the intonation is universal. She's asking who he is, or demanding that he not come any closer, or both. Dan raises his hands, palms forward, slowly, without any sudden movements. He shows her he's not holding anything. The girl takes a step back, then another. Then she turns and runs. The flickering light of the lantern dances in the darkness and vanishes behind the hill. Dan is left alone. The rain intensifies. He walks toward the sound of the bells. Half an hour later, the mud beneath his feet gives way to stone. A cobblestone pavement, chipped and crooked, but a real one. He enters the city. Narrow streets are squeezed between 2- and 3-story stone walls. Not a single electric light. Only torches in iron brackets at the intersections. Only oil lamps in the windows. Only candles. The town lives in semi-darkness. People move along the walls in short dashes from one patch of light to another. Dan sees 2 men with long poles on which braziers are burning. They're standing on a corner, discussing something with a passerby. Then one of them takes a coin from the passerby and walks on. The passerby follows him into the circle of light. Lantern bearers. They're selling a path through the darkness. Dan realizes this immediately. Light costs money here. Darkness kills here. He presses himself against the wall and watches. 3 boys scurry into an alley. A knife glints in the torchlight on one of them. Thieves. Darkness feeds them just as surely as it does the lamplighters. A patrol passes by. 2 in chainmail with swords and 1 with a torch. The torchbearer is more important than the soldiers. Without him, they're blind. Dan looks at all this and does the math. 3,000 residents, maybe 5,000. The main street is lit by torches every 30 meters. The side streets are in complete darkness. The consumption of oil and wax for a city like this must be monstrous. Half the budget goes to lighting. He remembers how he used to complain about his electricity bills in California. There's no electricity here at all. Here, there isn't even a concept that it's possible. The cold seeps to his bones. His jacket is soaked through. Dan walks along the street, looking for any kind of shelter. He can't read the signs. The language is foreign. The letters look like Latin, but aren't Latin. He navigates by sounds and smells. The sound of a hammer striking metal. Heat wafting from open doors. A blacksmith shop. He stops in the doorway. Inside, it's cramped and hot. The forge is burning down to red-hot coals. An old man sits at the workbench. He's burly, broad-shouldered, with hands like shovels. But his eyes are narrowed, and his head is bent right over the workpiece. He's practically burying his nose in the metal, trying to make out the brand. The old man is going blind. Dan realizes this the moment he steps inside. The blacksmith looks up. They stare at each other, a wet stranger in a strange blue jacket and an old, half-blind blacksmith. The old man says something. Dan doesn't understand a word. But the blacksmith points to the bench by the wall and to the pot over the coals. Sit down. Eat. That doesn't need translating. Dan sits down. The blacksmith pours him a bowl of something hot. Soup. Thick. With chunks of meat he can't identify. It doesn't matter. He eats, and for the first time since waking up, he feels something resembling gratitude. The old man introduces himself. Jormar. He points a finger at his chest and repeats it. Jormar. Dan points a finger at his own chest. Dan. Jormar nods. Then he gestures toward the bench. Sleep. Dan lies down. The coals in the forge flicker. Shadows dance across the walls. Tools hang on the walls. Hammers, pliers, files. And in the corner, on a shelf, he sees something that makes his heart leap. A dark, rough stone the size of a fist. Magnetite. He recognizes it by the distinctive sheen on the chip. The blacksmith uses it as a paperweight or a toy. For Dan, this is the beginning of everything. A magnet. Copper. Wire. A coil. A generator. Electricity. The chain of events unfolds in his mind instantly. From a piece of stone to a power plant. He knows every step. He went through every step at the university and repeated them in the field for 11 years. He falls asleep with this thought. Outside, a thunderstorm rumbles, and lightning splits the sky over a foreign city. The locals cross themselves and whisper prayers. They call lightning the finger of the Heavenly Father. Dan calls it the potential difference between the cloud and the ground, and he knows how to harness it. Morning came late. Dan opened his eyes and out of habit stretched for phone. My fingers clenched into thin air. That's right. Another world. 2 moons. The forge. He sat on bench and looked around. Jormar had it work. He stood at an anvil and struck with a hammer on the red-hot strip of metal. The blows were precise, but slow. The old man leaned toward each bite to make out the color of the heat. His eyes were failing him, and he compensated it with experience. But experience cannot replace insight when you need to make out a faint mark on blade. Dan walked up to him. They still didn't understand each other, but Dan through night picked up something. The language Jormar had a structure, cases, conjugations. Roots of some words resembled German. Dan pointed at objects and repeated after a blacksmith. Hammer, fire, water, metal, bread. Jormar patiently adjusted his pronunciation. By noon, Dan knew 40 words. By evening, 70. Grammar he picked up quickly. Not because that I was a linguist. It was that 11 years I worked with teams where half of the guys said in Spanish and a quarter in Tagalog. He got used to study in on the fly. On third day, he was able to build simple sentences. By fifth, led the conversation with pauses. Jormar told him about himself. His wife had died last winter. Kuznitsa is barely holding on. He used to, the best locks in town. Now doesn't can see small details and customers leave to younger people. Candles? They're enough. One wax candle costs his chicken. An oil lamp is 3 hours and smokes. Like this that in the morning the walls are black. He works in the light the horn, but horns cannot hold all night. It's too expensive. Dan listened and counted. A candle like a chicken. Lamp oil like a piglet. In a week, a city of 5,000 people spends more on lighting than on food. This isn't just an inconvenience. It's a systemic crisis. The economy is suffocating in the darkness. Surgeons aren't operating. Weavers aren't weaving. Scribes aren't writing. It's 2 a.m., and all these hours are lost. On the third night, Dan decided to take action. He asked Jormar for a copper blank. The blacksmith was surprised, but gave it to him. Dan asked for sour wine. Jormar pulled a jug from under the workbench. The wine was so sour, it was only good for cleaning metal. Perfect. Acetic acid, an electrolyte. Dan asked for that stone from the shelf. Dark, heavy. Jormar called it the stone that pulls. Magnetic iron ore. Dan took it in his hands and felt a familiar pull. A strong specimen. A natural magnet with good magnetization. He set to work. Jormar sat in the corner and watched. First, the copper. Dan asked the blacksmith for the thinnest sheet he could hammer out. Jormar hammered out a copper plate 3 coins thick. Roughly, but good enough. Dan cut it into 2 strips. Then he took an iron plate from the workbench, about the same size. Now for the electrolyte. He poured sour wine into a clay bowl. He lowered the copper strip and the iron strip into it, making sure they didn't touch each other. A galvanic cell, the most primitive one possible. Copper and iron in acid. The potential difference was about half a volt, negligibly small for any serious work, but enough to prove the principle. He asked Jormar to draw out a thin copper wire. The blacksmith worked with wire every day to make chainmail and locks. His fingers knew this work even when his eyes failed him. The wire came out uneven but functional. Dan wound it around an iron nail. 30 turns. Tight. Even. His fingers remembered this work better than anything else in the world. Thousands of coils over 11 years. He smoothed the ends of the wire. He touched one end to a copper plate in the solution, the other to an iron one. He closed the circuit. He held the coiled nail up to a handful of iron filings on the workbench. The filings twitched. Then they crept toward the nail and clung to it in an even, fuzzy ring. An electromagnet. Jormar opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then he sat down silently on the floor. He'd seen how the stone that pulls attracts iron. All blacksmiths knew that. But he had just seen a piece of an ordinary nail become a stone that pulls, by human will, through wet wire and sour wine. Dan didn't stop there. He spent the whole night at the apothecary's shop across the street. He knocked on the door until a sleepy woman in an apron opened it. Mireille Lescaut, the daughter of the late doctor. She had inherited the shop and the debts. Dan explained to her in his broken local language that he needed a glass vial, a small one, sealed. Mireille looked at the dirty stranger in the strange jacket with an expression as if she were deciding whether to call the guards or listen. She listened, perhaps out of curiosity, maybe because Dan was the first person in months to come into her shop for something other than a remedy for diarrhea. She gave him a thick glass vial. Dan returned to the forge. He burned a thin splinter in the furnace until it turned into a carbon thread. He placed the thread inside the vial. He threaded 2 copper wires through the neck. He sucked the air out with his mouth through the thin tube. His lungs burned. He didn't achieve a complete vacuum, but the rarefaction was sufficient. He sealed the neck with wax. He connected the prongs to a galvanic cell. The carbon filament inside the vial twitched. Then it began to take on color. Cherry red, dark orange, light orange. A dim, uneven light filled the forge. An incandescent lamp, the first in the world. It burned for 2 minutes and 9 seconds, Dan counted. Then the filament burned out, and the forge was once again plunged into the red twilight of the furnace. But those 2 minutes changed everything. Jormar was on his knees, not because he was praying, because his legs couldn't hold him up. He was crying, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down his soot-stained face and fell onto the stone floor. For 40 years he had worked by the light of coals. For 40 years he had squinted and leaned over the metal until his eyes began to fail. And now a stranger, speaking incomprehensible words, had lit the sun inside a glass bubble. For 2 minutes. But he'd lit it. Dan looked at the extinguished lamp and thought. The filament is too thin. The vacuum isn't strong enough. The cell is weak. 1 volt isn't enough. He needs a battery with several cells. He needs better insulation. He needs purer copper. He needs better glass. 100-item list of problems. But the principle works. Physics hasn't changed. Electrons flow. Resistance heats the conductor. Light is born from current. The same laws apply in this world as on Earth. That's all he needs to know. He turned to Jormar and, in broken local language, said that this wasn't a miracle. It's a craft, and he can make a light that will burn not for 2 minutes, but for an hour, and then all night long. Jormar looked at him. He wiped his face with his sleeve. He stood up. He picked up a heavy blacksmith's hammer. He placed it at Dan's feet, and he said one word that Dan already knew. Master. From that moment on, Jormar's smithy became the first electrical laboratory in the world of Veldania, and Daniel Hunter gained his first ally, an old, half-blind blacksmith who believed not in a miracle, but in a man. Next 3 weeks, Dan did not sleep than 4 hours in the day. Lists in his mind grew faster than he could cross out the items. The first problem is copper. Copper Jormar was dirty, full of impurities. Resistance of such wire was 10 times higher than necessary. Half of the energy was for heating instead of useful work. Dan explained to Jormar that he needed pure copper. The blacksmith brought it to market to a merchant. Tolstoy, sweaty man named Barg. Barg was selling copper ingots brought from southern mines. Dan examined the samples. Not good. Everything is bad. A greenish hue, said of high-content arsenic. the granular texture of poor fusion. He bought 5 ingots of the last money Yormar and reforged them himself. 4 reforge, each time removing the slag. Each time I get a little more pure metal. In 4th time, copper glowed pink. Not ideal. But it's enough for wires with several meters. The second problem is glass. A small bottle from Myri was thick-walled and murky. For the lamp, a thin, transparent bulb. Dan came to Mireille again. On this time in light daylight. The pharmacists turned out to be small and crammed shelves with hundreds jars. Herbs, ointments, tinctures, powders, and glass. A lot of glass. Myri made it all, blown test tubes and flasks for her potions. She had a small glass-blowing furnace in back room. Dan explained that he needed thin-walled sphere measuring about a fist. Mireille looked at him over her glasses. The glasses were an amazing thing in this world. 2 lenses in copper frame. My father made them for her himself. The only in the kingdom person who knew how to polish glass to vision. He died 2 years ago and took the secret with him. Mireille asked why he sphere. Dan replied that he wants to catch light inside the glass. Mireille didn't laugh. She asked a second question. That's exactly. Dan began explain, and 5 minutes later, he realized he was talking to someone who understood. Not physics, not electricity, but the principle of cause and effect, a logical chain. If you heat a filament, it glows. If you remove the air, the filament won't burn out. If you create a vacuum inside the glass, the filament will glow for a long time. Mireille listened without interrupting. Then she said she'd blow 10 bulbs for him by tomorrow evening, and that she wanted to see when he'd turn on the light. Dan agreed. Mireille's flasks were works of art, slender, transparent, smooth. Her hands knew glass as well as Yormar's hands knew metal. Dan threaded 2 copper wires through the neck of each flask, with a carbon filament between them. Then he sealed them. The vacuum was still a problem. He sucked out the air with his mouth and sealed it with wax. Rough. Unreliable. The filament quickly oxidized in the residual oxygen. But the third version of the lamp burned not for 2 minutes, but for 12. The 4th lasted 20. The 5th, 40 minutes. With the 6th, he achieved an hour of continuous light. A warm orange glow flooded the smithy. Yormar sat under the lamp and, for the first time in 3 years, could see the markings on his locks without having to hold them up to his eyes. He made 3 locks that evening. It used to take him a week to make 3 locks. Mireille stood in the doorway and watched. The light from the lamp reflected off her glasses. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that a patient of hers had died yesterday, a 6-year-old boy. A sore throat had developed into an abscess. She hadn't been able to lance it because, by candlelight, she couldn't see where to cut. If she'd had a light like this, she would have saved him. Dan looked at her. Then he took the lamp off the hook and carried it to Mireille's shop. He set it on the table. He connected it to a battery pack of 4 galvanic cells. Light flooded the small operating room, every shelf, every instrument, every vial. Mireille stood in the midst of that light, her hands trembling. Dan said it was her lamp. She could use it every night. He would change the battery every 3 days. Mireille took off her glasses. She rubbed her eyes, put them back on, and said that if he needed help with the glass or anything else, she'd be happy to help. For free. Simply because light like that shouldn't belong to just one person. The third problem was more dangerous than the first 2. Language. Dan was getting better at speaking the local language, but he couldn't control the words he was saying. In the second week, he was explaining to Yormar why you shouldn't touch both wires at the same time, and he used the word flow. Current is a flow of particles, invisible ones, that move through metal like water through a pipe. Jormar listened and nodded, and then he told his neighbor. The neighbor told his wife. The wife told a vendor at the market. By the end of the week, rumors were spreading throughout the city that a stranger lived in Jormar's smithy, a stranger who commanded invisible spirits. The word spirits was the key, because the Most Holy Cathedral dealt with invisible entities in this world, and anything that even remotely resembled heresy was punished. Mire warned Dan. She knew how city gossip worked. She knew how the church worked. Her father was a court physician and had seen how the cathedral had destroyed 3 alchemists for claiming that fire was not a gift from God, but a chemical reaction. Dan realized he needed a different strategy. He stopped using words that might arouse suspicion. Invisible particles became the breath of copper. Current became the metal's life force. Voltage became the pressure of its breath. He translated physics into a language the medieval world could accept without horror. And it worked. People nodded. Copper breathes, of course. Everything breathes. Stones breathe. Trees breathe. Why shouldn't copper breathe? By the end of the first month, the workshop had grown. Jormar worked with the metal. Mire blew glass flasks and prepared the electrolyte. Dan assembled lamps and batteries. 3 people, 1 workbench, 20 working lamps. Each one burned for an hour to an hour and a half. Dan gave away 5 lamps for free, to Jormar, to Mire, to the baker across the street, to the laundress on the next street over, and to the old night watchman at the city gates, who sat in complete darkness every night, afraid to fall asleep because he wouldn't hear the thieves. Each lamp was made for a specific person. For the baker, he made a hanging lamp to illuminate the oven from above. For the laundress, a table lamp with a wide reflector so she could see stains on the fabric. For the guard, a small portable lamp with a handle. He put the remaining 15 lamps up for sale. The price was simple. 1 lamp cost as much as 10 wax candles. But it burned 20 times longer. The economic logic was irrefutable. By the end of the first month, Dan had 15 orders and a waiting list of 30 names. Money finally started coming in. Not much, but enough to buy more copper and hire his first assistant, a boy named Court, 14 years old, a butcher's son. His hands were rough but nimble. He bent wire faster than Dan and didn't ask questions. He just did as he was told. Dan began to teach him, carefully, step by step. This is a wire. This is a battery. This is a circuit. You connect the wire like this, the battery like this. If you touch both ends at the same time, you'll get a shock. Not a strong one, but it's unpleasant. Court touched them. He got a jolt. He pulled his hand back and cursed. Then he looked at Dan with respect. The first safety lesson in the history of Veldania had been completed. Rumors spread faster than lamps. At beginning the second month at Jormar's, Jormar had been all Lower Town. A stranger in blue jacket who is light without a flame. Some called him a miracle worker. Others called him a charlatan. Still others, a heretic. Dan ignored the rumors and worked. He improved the battery. Instead of a single galvanic cell, I used 6 connected in series. 3 volts. The bulbs shone brighter and longer. The filaments he learned to make from bamboo, which in Veldania there was, but there was a similar grass with stiff stem. Charred in kiln without access air, it emitted carbon thread which held an hour and a half hours. The vacuum still remained weak. Dan worked on a mercury pump, but mercury in this world was more than silver. Mireille was looking for a supplier. Everything changed in one night. Dan was in the blacksmith shop when he was woken up knocking. Quiet. Persistent. He opened the door. At threshold stood a man on expensive coat with a hood. Behind them, 2 servants carrying torches. The man introduced himself. Baron Tress, a petty A landowner with a mansion on a hill near the eastern gate. He said he'd heard about the lamps and wanted to order lighting for his house. The entire house. 12 rooms. Dan quoted a price. The Baron didn't haggle. That was the first warning sign. No one in this world paid without haggling. The second sign was that the Baron asked for the lamps to be installed in 3 days, urgently, before the arrival of an important guest. The third sign was that the Baron's servants weren't looking at Dan, but were glancing around, professionally, like people accustomed to guarding or watching. Dan agreed. He couldn't turn down his first major client. He needed the money. He needed the copper. He needed the reputation. He took Court with him and worked for 4 days at Baron Tress's mansion. He ran wires along the walls. He mounted lamps in the copper shades that Jormar had forged. He connected the battery packs in the basement. He hid the wiring behind the tapestries. By the evening of the 4th day, 12 rooms were lit. The Baron walked through the house and couldn't stop looking around. The light was even. No soot, no smell, no risk of fire. His wife was crying with happiness in the bedroom because for the first time she could see the colors of her dresses in real light rather than the yellow glow of candles. Dan received his payment and returned to the smithy. That same night, he was nearly killed. He arrived late. Jormar was already asleep. A jug of wine stood on the workbench. Next to it was a note in the local language. Dan read it with difficulty. From Baron Tress. Thanks for the work. The best wine from his cellar. Dan poured himself a mug. He raised it to his lips. The smell stopped him. Something sweet beneath the aroma of the wine. Something that shouldn't be there. He set the mug on the table and walked across the street to Mireille's. It was past midnight, but he kept knocking until she opened the door. Sleepy. Angry. In her nightgown. He held out the mug to her and asked her to smell it. Mireille took it, brought it to her nose. Her expression changed instantly. Sleep vanished. Her anger vanished. A cold, focused calm remained. She said one word. Night ivy. Dan didn't know what it was. Mireille explained. A poisonous plant. Rare. Expensive. A few drops of the tincture in wine and a person falls asleep within an hour, wakes up 3 days later. Or doesn't wake up at all. It depends on the dose. This dose was lethal. Mireille identified it by its scent because she'd worked with poisons her whole life. Her father had taught her to recognize poisoning at court. Dan stood in the apothecary's shop and thought. Baron Tress. A generous client who never haggled. An urgent order. Servants with trained eyes. And poisoned wine as a gift. Someone wanted to kill him. Or put him to sleep. Who and why was still unclear. Mireille said that night ivy was used by the Silent Brothers. Dan asked who they were. Mireille explained. A secret order affiliated with the Holy Council. Formally, it doesn't exist. Informally, it does the dirty work for Archpriest Mordant. Poisonings, kidnappings, accidents. There were no more than 20 of them in the entire kingdom, but each was worth 10 soldiers. Dan understood. The church had found out about him. The church had decided he was dangerous. The church had sent assassins through a frontman, a baron, quickly. He'd only been here 2 months, and they already wanted him dead. That was frightening. But it also meant he was doing something right. If his lamps were a sham, the cathedral would have ignored them. They kill what they fear, and what they fear is what works. Mireille asked what he was going to do. Dan thought for a minute. Then he said he needed a patron. Someone strong enough that the church couldn't just send an assassin. Someone who needed the light more than they needed friendship with Mordant. Mireille looked at him for a long time. Then she said she knew one such person, or rather, one such woman. Queen Regent Celestine Valmark. She hates the cathedral. The cathedral hates her. They've been at an impasse for 5 years now. The Queen needs any advantage that will tip the balance in her favor. Light without the Church's approval could be such an advantage. Dan asked how to get to the Queen. Mireille said it was impossible, but she could write a letter to one of the court physicians who had known her father. It would be a long road. Dan nodded. A long, long way. For now, he had to survive. He returned to the smithy. He poured the poisoned wine into the drainage ditch. He woke Jormar and explained the situation. The old blacksmith wasn't afraid. He stood up. He took a heavy war hammer from the shelf, one he hadn't touched in 20 years. He stood by the door and said he'd keep one eye open now. Dan looked at him and thought that an old, half-blind blacksmith with a battle hammer wasn't exactly the most reliable guard in the world. But it was better than nothing. And this man was ready to die for him. Not for his lamps, not for his knowledge, for him. Dan lay down on the bench and couldn't fall asleep. He thought about how, in his old life, his main problem had been a safety report that had to be turned in by Friday. And now his main problem was people who wanted to kill him for giving other people light. The world had changed, but the equation remained the same. There is energy, there is resistance. He needs to find the path of least resistance and direct the energy there. He's an engineer. He knows how to do this. In the morning, he began building a second set of batteries with double the power. There was a lot of work to do. Time was short. His enemies were already close by. The patron found him before the Dan found a patron. After 2 weeks after the poisoning in the smithy, a woman. She was simply a gray raincoat, a hood, no decorations or logos, with her one bodyguard, a burly, silent man in plain clothing, but with a sword under her cloak. The woman introduced herself as Merchant Fabrics. She said that she had heard about lamps and wants one for his workshop. Dan showed her the selection, 3 models, tabletop, hanging, portable. The woman examined each one, not as a shopper, as an engineer. She checked the fasteners, she touched the wires, she looked inside the flask. I asked a question that no one of the customers had asked her. How long will battery, and can it recharge? Recharge. Dan looked at her intently. The shopkeeper Fabric doesn't ask about a recharge. The saleswoman Fabric asks how it costs. He replied to thee honestly. The battery of 6 cells lasts about 30 hours. It. You need to change the electrolyte and clean the plates every 2 days. Cost of service is approximately 1/3 of the cost of an equivalent quantity candles. The woman nodded. Then she asked how many lamps he could produce per month. Dan said 20 at current capacities, 50 if double the reserve copper and hire 2 more, 100 if to build a separate workshop. The woman asked what he find to get to 100. Dan listed room, copper, 3 employees, protection against church. The last point he said while looking her straight into an eyes. The woman smiled, the first time in the conversation. She pulled her hood. Her face was beautiful, but tired. Shadows under the eyes spoke of the years without a normal sleep. Fine around the mouth suggested of the habit clenching lips when I feel like scream. That was a face of a man who is holding on shoulders the weight too heavy for one person. Mireille, who was standing in corner of the workshop, quietly, she sank to her knees. Jormar dropped the hammer. Court opened his, and forgot to close it. Celestina Valmark, Queen Regent of Veldania, mother of the young king. the only wall between the throne and chaos. She came on her own, without entourage, without heralds, in gray cloak a merchant's. That's because I wanted to see with my own. Dan didn't to his he because that he was insolent. It was that didn't know that in this world it is customary to stoop to knees before the queen. In his world, in front of clients, did became on there, even in very important ones. Celestina looked at him with curiosity. The stranger who does not bows, or a fool, or from such far-off place where there are kings. She said that she looked about him than he thinks. He knows about lamps. He knows about an poisoning attempt. Knows that the Quiet brothers received an order from Mordant, and knows that Myri Laskin wrote a letter to her court 3 days ago. The letter arrived quickly, but the queen decided to come herself even before the letter. That's that light without fire is not just convenience. It's weapon. Against the church. Against darkness. Against everything that holds it kingdom by the throat. Dan listened and thought. He understood the situation. The queen wants to use his technology as a trump card in the fight against the council, as an economic lever, as a symbol. But it can betray. She is a queen. She thinks them it's professional. He said that he's to work with her, but him, there are conditions. Celestina raised an eyebrow. Conditions? A craftsman is setting conditions for the queen. Dan stated the first condition. The workshop remains independent, not royal property, not a court-run manufactory. An independent workshop with the right to sell lamps to anyone, rich or poor. The second condition, protection from the council, official, with a seal. The third condition, copper at a fixed price, directly from the mines, no middlemen, no guild markups. Celestina was silent. The bodyguard behind her placed his hand on his sword. Mireille in the corner stopped breathing. Then the queen laughed, briefly, dryly, like someone who hadn't laughed in a long time and had forgotten how. She said that he was either very brave or didn't understand who he was talking to. Dan replied that he understood, but he also understood that she needed him more than he needed her, because he possessed knowledge that could not be taken away. And she had a crown that people were trying to take from her. They could help each other. Or he could go to another city. Lamps were needed everywhere. It was a bluff. Dan couldn't go to another city. He didn't have money for the journey, and the Silent Brothers would find him within a week. But Celestina didn't know that. Or maybe she did, but she appreciated the audacity. She agreed to all 3 conditions, and added her own. Dan would light up the palace's throne room, personally, in time for the winter ball, in 4 months. Dan said it was possible, but the throne room isn't a blacksmith shop. It would require wiring along the entire perimeter, high-powered batteries, dozens of lamps. This was a scale he hadn't attempted yet. Celestina said it was his problem. She'd provide protection and copper. He'd provide the light. That was the contract. She held out her hand. Dan shook it. The queen's hand was cold and firm, the hand of a person accustomed to signing death warrants. When she left, Mireille exhaled and sat down on the floor. Jormar raised his hammer. Court covered his mouth. Dan stood in the middle of the workshop and thought. He had just struck a deal with the queen. He had promised to light up the throne room in 4 months. He had 6 working hands, including his own, 20 working lamps, 1 battery model, no generator, no stable infrastructure. He had promised something he couldn't yet deliver. Like any good engineer, first you take the job, then you figure out how to do it. For the next 2 weeks, he worked like a man possessed. He expanded the workshop. He took over a second room in Yormar's house. He hired 2 more assistants. The first was a quiet teenager named Tom, an orphan from a children's home, slow but meticulous. His solder joints were neater than Dan's. The second was Hannah Yoon. She came on her own, a short, wiry girl with black hair and fierce eyes, half-blood, the daughter of an Eastern merchant and a local servant. She worked as a porter at the port because no one would hire her for a normal job due to her mixed heritage. She came into the workshop and said she wanted to haul copper. Dan gave her a coil of copper wire and asked her to take it up to the second floor. She picked up 20 kilograms with one hand and left. But on her way back, she stopped at the workbench. She looked at the battery pack diagram that Dan had drawn with charcoal on the board, and she said that the third cell was connected incorrectly. Dan looked at the diagram, then at Hannah. The third cell was indeed connected with the wrong polarity. He'd drawn that diagram at 3 in the morning and made a mistake. Hannah spotted the error at a glance, without any training, without any explanation, just by the logic of the drawing. Dan asked if she could read. Hannah said no. Dan asked if she could count. Hannah said up to 100. Dan said he could find a dozen porters, but he hadn't found a single person in 2 months who could read a diagram at a glance. He gave her a seat at the workbench. Hannah sat down. She looked at the tools. She looked at Dan and said one word. Boss. Not master like everyone else. Boss. In her broken language, a mix of her father's Eastern accent and dockyard slang. Dan smiled. In his previous life, only Mexican mechanics had called him that, those who respected him but weren't about to show it. Hannah fit into the workshop like a missing piece in a diagram. After a week, she knew the names of all the tools. After 2 weeks, she was winding coils faster than Court. After 3 weeks, she was calculating windings using the formulas Dan drilled into her head every evening. She remembered everything the first time. Perfect visual memory. Dan would show her a diagram once, and she'd reproduce it with charcoal on the board without a single mistake. He made her a wooden tag. He carved it with a knife one evening by lamplight. Name, Hannah Yoon. Position, Senior Apprentice. Number 1. The first employee tag in the workshop's history. Hannah took it. She read it letter by letter. Then she put it around her neck on a leather cord and said she'd take it off when she died. It wasn't just for show. For a girl who, at 19, had been told she was a nobody, that wooden tag was more precious than gold. The workshop was growing. 6 people, 3 workbenches, 40 lamps in production, orders booked 2 months in advance, and 4 months until the winter ball. Dan stood at his workbench every night, sketching out the lighting plan for the throne room. The scale was daunting. But he was an engineer, and engineers aren't daunted by scale. They break it down into tasks. 4 months until the ball. Dan set the task into stages. The first stage is reconnaissance. It must see the throne hall with his own other. Measure the walls, count the windows, estimate the length of the wiring. Celestina sent for a carriage through 3 days after the visit. Black, without coats of arms, with curtained windows. Bodyguard, that one. Silent, with sword. Dan went through the streets of Kervalone and looked into the gap between the curtains. The city was wider than he thought. The upper city on hill is separated from the lower, stone wall. The palace at summit, the cathedral nearby. 2 centers of power stand opposite each across the square. Symbolic. Throne Hall impressed him size, 40 meters in length, 15 in wide. Ceiling 10 meters. Stone walls, stone floor, tapestries, stained glass windows, and complete darkness in the corners, because that 20 candles in 3 chandeliers lit only the center of the hall. The corners were in darkness. The courtiers huddled toward the light like moths. Dan walked through the hall with a coil rope and measured in paces. The courtiers watched at him as a strange animal. The stranger in blue jacket with mysterious tools. Someone whispered that he was a new jester. Someone else said he was a sorcerer. Dan paid no attention. He was doing the math. 40 lamps at least, 60 for full coverage, 200 meters of wire, a battery pack with 120 cells. Or... He stopped. He looked out the window. Beyond the palace, on the hillside, he could see the roofs of mills by the river. Water mills. 4 of them. Their wheels turned in the current day and night. Mechanical energy. Free. Constant. If he installed a generator on one of the mills, he wouldn't need hundreds of batteries. A single generator could power the entire throne room. And not just the room. The whole palace. The whole street. The whole neighborhood. The scale of the task had changed. This was no longer just a job to light a room. This was the first power plant. He returned to the workshop and gathered everyone. Yormar, Myri, Court, Tom, Hannah. 6 people at the workbench, lit by 3 lamps. Dan explained the plan. They wouldn't be hauling 120 batteries into the palace. They would build a machine that turns the movement of water into the breath of copper. He used local terms. Not a generator. A machine that breathes. Not electricity. Breath. Yormar asked how big the machine would be. Dan gestured with his hands. 1 meter tall, half a meter wide, a copper coil inside, magnets all around. The axle is connected to a water wheel. The wheel turns, the coil spins between the magnets. The copper begins to breathe. The breath flows through the wires. The lamps light up. Simple. Yormar said it wasn't simple. It's madness. But he said it with a smile. Work began. Dan divided up the tasks. Yormar forged the generator housing and mounts. Thick iron plates for the core. An axle made of hardened steel. Bronze bearings. Dan sketched every detail in charcoal on a board, and Hannah memorized the drawing. When Yormar forgot a measurement, Hannah would prompt him from memory. Mire worked on the insulation. Dan showed her how to make a coating from cowhide, resin, and mica that could withstand 400 volts. She experimented, 10 recipes in a week, each one better than the last. On the 11th try, the insulation withstood a voltage surge from a fully charged battery without a single spark. Mire wrote the recipe down in her notebook and circled it with a double border. Court and Tom were pulling wire, kilometers of wire. Both of their hands were rubbed raw with calluses. Dan made them wooden handles for the wire pullers. A simple contraption. 2 small boards with a groove. You pull the wire through the groove and it comes out straight. Their productivity tripled. Hannah counted the windings. Dan explained the principle to her. The more windings, the higher the voltage. The thicker the wire, the greater the current. Voltage is pressure. Current is flow. You have to find a balance. Too much voltage and the insulation won't hold up. Too much current and the wires will overheat. Hannah listened, and an hour later she came up with the winding calculation, which Dan checked twice. Not a single mistake. She calculated in her head faster than he could on paper. After a month of work, the generator was assembled. Ugly. Heavy. made of rough iron and coils of wire wrapped in leather and resin. Dan looked at it and saw 1,000 flaws. The gaps were too wide, the bearings were damp, the winding was uneven. But it was a generator, the first in this world. They transported it to the mill at night. The Queen's bodyguard ensured a quiet passage through the upper city. Dan personally connected the generator's shaft to the water wheel's shaft via a belt drive. The wheel turned slowly. Too slowly. Dan recalculated the gear ratio and asked Yormar to forge a new pulley, a bigger one, 3 times as big. With the new pulley, the generator picked up speed. The copper coil spun between the magnets. Dan connected a multimeter from his breast pocket to the output terminals, a device he'd brought from his own world. The only tool left from his past life. The multimeter's battery was still good. He flipped the switch. The needle twitched. It crept to the right and stopped at 28. 28 volts of alternating current. Dirty, unstable, fluctuating. But alternating current. For the first time in this world's history, a machine had converted the motion of water into electricity. Dan stood by the mill, wet from the river spray, and watched the multimeter's needle. 28 volts. In his past life, that wouldn't have been enough to charge a laptop. In this life, it was enough to light up the palace. Hannah stood nearby, looking at the device with its black screen and needle. She didn't understand the numbers, but she understood the look on Dan's face. He was smiling. So it worked. She asked what came next. Dan said the next step was the wires. A kilometer of wires from the mill to the palace, across the entire upper city, along the walls, across the rooftops, underground. Hannah said it was madness. Dan replied that she was already the 3rd person to say that, and he was beginning to suspect that madness was his working method. They returned to the workshop at dawn. Dan hadn't slept, but he felt alive. For the first time in months, he wasn't just surviving. He was truly alive. He was building. Not a light bulb, not a battery, a system. Generation, transmission, distribution, consumption, protection. Every link in the chain demanded solutions that didn't exist in this world, and he was creating them, one by one, just as he'd done his whole life. Only now, the stakes were a little higher than a report due by Friday. Wires became the main problem. Not technically, politically. To drag wires along the walls of the city meant to work in plain sight. Every pole, every hook, every insulator on the wall of the house. All this was people. People asked questions. Questions reached to the synod. Archpriest Mordaunt did not sit idle. Meanwhile, Dan was building the generator Mordaunt was differently. Quietly. Systematically. His people bought up copper. 3 merchants' metal who supplied the workshop received offers from unknown buyers. The price was twice higher the market price. They sold it. Dan arrived for another batch and discovered that copper wasn't there. No at Barga, nor at the other suppliers. All copper in the city has been bought. And not by just anyone. By the city of makers. Dan didn't realize the connection. Candlesticks and copper. What is the Crippet Bee does to metallurgy, Mireille explained. The candle makers is not just artisans. They cartel. They control the market of light. Every candle, every lamp, every lantern, everything passes through them. Their turnover is comparable to the budget of a duchy. And lamps, Dan's threatened, destroy their business. The candlestick makers did not kill anyone. They didn't not poisoners. They did something worse. They cut off resources. Without medicine, no wires. Without wires, no lamps. Without bulbs, none Dana. A clean economics. Dan remembered that he had said about candlesticks. Popov and spies he was afraid of, but candlesticks he was more of all. That's that with a fanatic, as argue. With a murderer, you can fight. You an accountant who cut you off your deliveries, not there's anything. He thought 3 days. Then I went to Celestine. The Queen received him into a small reception room, without entourage, just her and a bodyguard. Dan explained the problem. He needs copper. A lot. On a regular basis. The guild has halted supplies. He asks the Queen to intervene. Celestine listened. Then she said that the guild's candle pays 10% of all taxes to the treasury. If it starts a war with the guild, treasury will lose money, of which N anyway doesn't have. She can't afford. Dan stood in front of her and realized that diplomacy is not his strong point. But logic is its strong point, and he proposed a solution. Don't break up the guild. To get around it, copper can be obtained not from city merchants, but directly from the mines. The southern mines belong to the crown. Celestina can issue an order for direct delivery. The guild won't be able to buy up the ore on site. Too expensive, too far away. The Queen thought it over. Then she nodded. She would issue the order. But she had a condition in return. The deadline. The throne room must be ready not for the winter ball, but for the fall council, 2 months earlier. Dan felt his stomach clench. 2 months. He'd lost 2 weeks due to the copper shortage. The generator is working, but the wiring hasn't been laid. The lamps for the hall weren't assembled. The insulation hadn't been tested on the long sections. He'd said yes, because he had no choice. On his way back to the workshop, he stopped by Mireille's. It was late. The shop was already closed. Mireille opened the door wearing an apron splattered with something green. She was working on a new insulation formula. Dan walked in and sat down on a stool. Mireille looked at him and, without a word, poured him some tea. She had learned to read his face. Fatigue, anxiety, stubbornness, all at once. He told her about the postponed deadlines. Mireille listened. Then she said she had an idea about the vacuum. She'd found a way to pump air out of the flasks better than by mouth. A water pump. Simple. 2 cylinders and a valve. She'd already assembled a prototype out of pharmacy tubes. If it worked, the lamps would stay lit not for an hour and a half, but for 5 or 6. Dan looked at the prototype. Rough, made of wood and leather. But the principle was sound. A piston vacuum pump. Mireille had invented it herself, without any hints, without a textbook, simply because she understood that the vacuum was the key problem and was looking for a solution. It was then that Dan first realized that Mireille wasn't just his ally. She was his equal. In another world, she would be a scientist, a professor, a lab director. Here, she's a pharmacist in debt. The world is just as unfair here as it is there. He told her that. Not with those exact words, with the words he knew in the local language. He said she was smarter than half the engineers he'd worked with in his previous life. Mireille took off her glasses and wiped them. Her hands trembled slightly. She said that his past life was an interesting topic and that she still didn't know where he was from. Dan remained silent. He couldn't tell her the truth, not because he was afraid, because the truth sounded crazier than any heresy. Another world, another time, machines without horses, voices from boxes, light from an invisible force flowing through copper wires for hundreds of kilometers. If Mordant had declared him a heretic for the light bulb, then for the story of his past life, they'd burn him in the square by lunchtime. He told Mireille that one day he'd tell her, when it was safe. Mireille put her glasses back on and nodded. She knew how to wait. The next 6 weeks were hell. The copper arrived from the southern mines, rough, unprocessed. It had to be smelted and drawn into wire from scratch. Dan hired 4 more people. The workshop had grown to 12 people. Jormar's smithy could no longer accommodate everyone, so Celestina set aside an empty warehouse for them near the market square, a large stone building with a high ceiling. Dan divided it into zones: the smelting area, the drawing area, assembly, testing. Each zone had its own supervisor. Jormar was in charge of the metal, Mireille handled the glass and insulation, Hanna oversaw assembly and calculations, Court and Tom managed the wire drawing. Dan oversaw everything and assembled the lamps. They drew the wires at night. The Queen provided a patrol that didn't ask any questions. Dan personally mounted the insulators on the walls, ceramic ones. Mireille developed a glaze formula that kept moisture out. She fired each insulator herself in her own kiln, 140 of them, 2 for each support pole, 70 poles from the mill to the palace. The wire ran along the rooftops, invisible from below. Only if you looked up could you see a thin copper thread stretched from pole to pole. Dan checked every connection personally, every twist, every contact. One bad connection and the entire line is dead. Or worse, it catches fire. 3 weeks before the fall council, what Dan feared happened. A short circuit near the city gates. The wire had rubbed against a stone ledge. The insulation burst. The copper touched the wet wall. A spark, a flash, a crash. The sentry on the wall shouted that a fire had broken out. A patrol ran over and saw the melted wire and the chipped stone. No one was hurt, but rumors spread instantly. Lightning in the wall, God's wrath, a curse. Mordaunt exploited the incident. The next day, in the square in front of the cathedral, a preacher shouted about a false prophet who was dragging copper snakes along the city's holy walls and summoning heavenly fire. The crowd listened. Some believed, some doubted, but everyone was afraid. Dan stood in his workshop and thought the preacher was right about one thing. He really was dragging copper snakes along the walls, and heavenly fire really could strike if the insulation wasn't repaired. He replaced the damaged section overnight. He doubled the thickness of the insulation at all the problem spots. He added a ground wire, a copper rod driven into the ground at every 3rd pole. If a short circuit happened again, the current would go into the ground instead of the wall. Safety. What he'd been taught for 11 years. What saves lives. Mordaunt could shout about curses all he wanted. Physics was on Dan's side. He just had to apply it correctly. After a week before the fall council, Dan didn't sleep 3 days. The line from mill to the palace was built. 70 pillars, 140 insulators, 1 kilometer and 200 meters of copper wire. Generator at the mill operated consistently, 28 volts. Hanna calculated the losses online. 4 volts were lost into resistance of the wires, until the palace reached 24. That's for 40 lamps, back to back, no spare. Dan hated as his life he never didn't work without reserve of power. 20% on top, at a minimum. Here, reserve was 1. 1 burnt-out bulb and the balance will be lost. The voltage across the rest will spike. The wires will not hold. Cascading failure. He set in the throne chamber 40 lamps. There 10 per each wall. In copper shades which Jormar forged from his blueprints. With reflectors made polished tin. The light from each lamp was directed in the hall and not into ceiling. The wiring ran behind the tapestries, invisible, neat. Each connection was sealed with wax and wrapped in leather. He installed the main switch in a niche by the entrance, a simple copper lever. Up means on, down means off. Next to it was a spare set of filaments for the lamps and tools for quick replacement. Mireille helped with the last few bulbs. Her vacuum pump ran smoothly, and the new lamps burned for 6 hours at a time. She had spent just as many sleepless nights in the workshop as Dan. Her hands were scorched from the glass-blowing furnace. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but she didn't complain. Only once, one night when they were alone in the workshop, did she say she was afraid. Not for herself, for him. If something went wrong at the council meeting, Mordant would have a reason to destroy everything. The workshop, the mill, the generator, the wires, the people. Dan looked at her. The lamp between them lit her face from below. The shadows of her glasses fell across her forehead. She was beautiful, not the regal beauty of a queen, but the beauty of someone who does important work and forgets about herself. He said everything would work out, because physics doesn't fail. People do, but physics doesn't. Mireille smiled and said it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. Dan didn't understand what she meant. Or maybe he did, but pretended not to. He wasn't ready for this. Not here. Not now. Maybe later. The Autumn Council. The hall had been filling up since midday. 32 barons and dukes, 12 guild representatives, 8 high priests, the queen on the throne, the young king beside her in a chair that was too big for him, Archpriest Mordant in the front row. His face was expressionless. The candles burned as usual, 120 of them in 3 chandeliers. No one knew that copper wires ran along the walls behind the tapestries. No one knew that a machine was running at the mill by the river. No one knew that a circuit breaker stood in the niche by the entrance. Except for Dan. Except for Hannah, who was on duty at the mill by the generator. Except for Mireille, who was standing by the spare set of lamps. Except for Jormar, who stood by the back entrance with a hammer, just in case anyone tried to cut the wires. The council meeting lasted 3 hours. Dan waited outside the door. Celestina gave him a signal. When the council finished discussing taxes, she would send a page. The page arrived when it was already dark outside the windows. Dan entered the hall. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward him. A stranger in a blue jacket. Dirty. Sooty. With singed fingers. Amid the silks and furs, he looked like a piece of coal in a jewelry box. Mordant saw him, and his eyes narrowed. He recognized Dan. He knew who he was. But he didn't know what Dan was doing in the palace. Celestina stood up. She announced that she wanted to show the council something new, a gift for the kingdom. Light without fire. Light without candles. Light without oil. A murmur rippled through the hall. Mordant leaned forward. Dan walked up to the niche. He placed his hand on the switch. He looked out at the hall. 32 barons, 12 guild members, 8 priests, the queen, the child king, the archpriest. Everyone was looking at him. He flipped the switch upward. 1 second. 2. 3. Nothing. Dan's heart stopped. Then the lamps flared to life. Not all at once, in waves, from the entrance to the throne, one after another. 10, 20, 30, 40. A warm, even light flooded the throne room from wall to wall. For the first time in the centuries of this hall's existence, not a single dark corner remained. Light poured in from everywhere. No smoke, no soot, no flickering. Even, steady, alive. The hall fell silent, complete silence. Then one of the barons stood up, followed by a second, a third. They looked around like children who had stumbled into a new world. They looked at their hands in this light, at each other's faces, at the ceiling, which they were seeing for the first time because the candles had never reached that high. The little king jumped out of his chair and ran along the wall, touching the light fixtures. His mother didn't stop him. She was looking at the light, and her face bore an expression Dan had never seen before. hope. Mordaunt sat motionless. His hands gripped the armrests of the chair. His knuckles were white. He looked at the lamps as if he saw in them something others did not. A threat. Not to the light, not to people, to order. His order. Dan stood by the circuit breaker with a scorched hand and a soot-stained face, listening to the hum of current in the wires. Quiet, steady, constant, like a heartbeat. He had heard that sound thousands of times in his former life. At substations in the California mountains, at transformer boxes in the suburbs, on utility poles along the highway. The hum of electricity, the most ordinary sound for an electrician, the most incredible sound for a world that had known nothing of electricity until tonight. The council meeting ended in silence. The barons dispersed, glancing back at the lamps. The guild members whispered among themselves. The priests crossed themselves. Mordaunt left first, without saying a word. Celestina beckoned Dan to the throne. She said 2 words. "You did it." Then she added that tomorrow morning she wanted to discuss lighting the entire main street, from the market to the palace gates. Dan nodded and headed for the exit. At the door, he stopped and turned around. The little king was standing under one of the lamps, looking up at it. His face was bathed in light. He was smiling. Dan stepped out into the night. The air was cold. The stars were bright. 2 moons hung over the city, and behind him, the throne room glowed with a golden light that could be seen from the other end of Kirvalone. After the autumn council, life accelerated. Orders poured in droves. Every baron who saw the throne chamber wanted one light in his castle. Each guild master wanted lamps in workshop. The weavers wanted work at night. The jewelers wanted to see the color of the inn in light. The bakers wanted to keep an eye on the oven without get burned on candles. Dan refused 9 out of 10. He out of pride, out of physics. 1 generator on 1 mill produced 2028 volts. It was for the palace and the nearest houses. For the street needs a 2nd generator. For the city, 3rd and 4th. For the 2nd generator requires a 2nd mill. For the 3rd, 3rd. Or 1 large unit on river rapids with a capacity of 10 times higher. Hydroelectric power plant. A real one. Not a toy mill wheel, but dam, turbine, power lines, substation, transformers. Scale from which at Dan's heart and chest. Not out of fear, out of eagerness. He began to design. Every evening after work in workshop, he sat down at table and drew. The river rapids in 2 kilometers upstream of the town. Elevation, 4 meters. Water is steady year-round, except the dry month at end summer. He considered power. With the right turbine and generator, this threshold could produce 200 kilowatts, 200,000 watts, enough for the whole city, with some to spare. But this is a 1-year project, maybe 2. While he was designing the dams, reality wouldn't let him go. The workshop had grown to 25 people. Dan could no longer assemble every lamp himself. He taught, from morning till night. He demonstrated, he explained, he checked, he corrected. He yelled when someone grabbed a bare wire. He slapped their hands when someone tried to connect a battery without checking the polarity. And every evening he repeated the same thing. Electricity kills. If you haven't checked the insulation, don't touch it. If you haven't turned off the power, don't touch it. If you're not sure, ask. Better to ask a stupid question than end up a smart corpse. The students took it to heart. Not all of them right away. One apprentice named Greg got zapped by a 12-cell battery. 6 volts through his wet hands. He was jolted and thrown back onto the workbench. he wasn't seriously hurt, but he walked around as white as a sheet for 2 days. After that, he checked the insulation 3 times before every connection. Hannah was ruthless toward others' mistakes. She caught every crooked wire, every uneven coil, every loose connection, and she didn't hesitate to point them out aloud, loudly, in front of everyone. Dan once stopped her in the middle of berating a newbie and said that criticism was fine, but humiliation wasn't. Hannah glared at him. Then she nodded. From then on, she criticized more quietly, but no less accurately. The newbie she'd scolded went on to become one of the best assemblers in the workshop. Iris Mornvale showed up in late fall. She walked into the workshop wearing a dress that cost more than Dan's entire monthly turnover, with a hairstyle that required 2 hours of a maid's work, with a smile that promised everything and nothing at the same time. She said she wanted to buy a lamp for her boudoir. Dan showed her some models. She spent 40 minutes choosing. She asked questions about wattage, about brightness, about the color of the light. The questions were intelligent, too intelligent for a woman who supposedly just wanted a lamp by her bed. Hannah stood at the workbench and looked at her as if she were evaluating a tool. She didn't like the tool. Too shiny. Iris bought 2 lamps and left, but she came back the next day, and the next, and for a week she came every day. She asked questions about the wires, about the batteries, about how the generator worked. Dan answered because she asked well, specifically, to the point, without flirting. Well, almost without any flirting. By the second week, Dan gave her a soldering iron, not because she asked for it, because he saw her hands, long fingers, precise movements. When she picked up tools from the table, her grip was surgically precise. He told her to sit down. He showed her how to hold the soldering iron, how to apply solder, how to join 2 wires. Iris made her first solder joint. Crooked, wobbly. The solder clumped together. Dan showed her again. She made a second one. Better. A third. Almost even. A 10th. Perfect. The 20th. Better than half of his students. When she finished the 20th solder joint and raised her eyes to the smooth, shiny seam connecting the 2 wires, her eyes were wet. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were just wet. She said that for the first time in her life, she'd made something with her own hands. Something that worked. Something that made sense without a pretty dress or a perfect smile. Dan didn't know that Iris was the daughter of a disgraced duke. He didn't know she'd been sent to spy. He didn't know that a list of questions from the opposition faction was sewn into the lining of her dress. All he saw was a woman with skilled hands whom no one had ever given a soldering iron before. That was enough. Hannah hated her from day one, silently, professionally. She didn't speak of it aloud, but whenever Iris sat down at the workbench next to Dan, Hannah would get up and walk to the other end of the workshop. Dan noticed, but didn't understand. Or perhaps he understood but didn't want to get to the bottom of it. In his former life, conflicts within the crew were resolved simply. Talk it out, divide up areas of responsibility, and have a beer after the shift. Here, there was no beer. There weren't enough areas of responsibility, and a conversation required words he didn't know in the local language. Meanwhile, Mordant was preparing his strike. The Silent Brothers had failed in their poisoning attempt, but the archpriest was patient. He didn't send a second assassin. He chose a more terrifying weapon: the law. At the beginning of winter, a proclamation appeared in the square in front of the cathedral, a parchment bearing the seal of the Most Holy Cathedral. An official indictment. Daniel, a foreigner known as Master Thunder, is accused of practicing the dark arts, of summoning invisible entities, of creating objects containing captured heavenly fire, and of blasphemy, manifested in the substitution of a divine gift with a craft. The Inquisition trial is scheduled for 30 days from now. Attendance is mandatory. Failure to appear is considered an admission of guilt. There was only one punishment for an admission of guilt: the stake. Dan stood before the proclamation and read it twice. A crowd had gathered around him. People watched him, some with sympathy, some with fear, some with that particular hungry curiosity with which people of all worlds look upon those who may soon die. Hannah stood beside him. She placed her hand on his elbow and quietly said one word in her Eastern dialect, which Dan by then also understood a little. Fight. 30 days until the trial. Dan wasn't run. Running away meant losing everything. The workshop, the mill, the generator, the wires, people. 2 months of work. A year of life in this world. He will not give this to Mordant. Myrae came to him at that very meeting, that she knew the procedure of the trial. Her father was a witness at 3 such trials when served at the court. She explained. The court is in session, in the square in front of the cathedral. Present archpriest and 12 canons. The accused has the right to speak, but does not has the right to a defense attorney. Evidence is presented by the prosecution. The defendant may present counter-evidence. The decision is made by a vote of the canons, 7 of 12 in guilt, and the verdict takes into effect. Dan asked who these 12 canons. Myrae said that 5 of them were subordinate of Mordant, 3 are independent, 4 are undecided. To win, you need to convince the 4 undecided, and although just 1 of 3 independent ones, 7 votes in favor of not guilty. Dan thought all night. Then he began. Get ready. Not as a lawyer, as an engineer. The prosecution says that he is calling for invisible entities. Counter-argument. Show that there are no entities exist. There is copper, there is vinegar, there is iron, there are hands. Result is and reproducible. Anyone can do it again. The prosecution says that he captures heavenly fire. Counter-argument. Show that light is generated not from fire, but from the filament. Fire. There is heat. There is from electricity. Electric from the battery. Battery from chemistry. Chemistry from materials. Materials from the earth. Everything earthly. Nothing heavenly. The accusation says that he substitutes the divine gift with a craft. Counter-argument. He does not substitute. He examines what that Heavenly Father has instilled into nature. Copper doesn't not because that Dan ordered him to, but because that's the world it had learned to listen. This last argument was the key one. Dan realized that he could defeat Mordant in his territory. If he says that the electricity is physics, his will burn for denial the divine. If he says that it's magic, his will be burned for witchcraft. The only way out is third position. Electricity is part of the divine plan, the hidden power embedded in nature by the Heavenly Father. Dan did not discover a new God. He discovered a new chapter in the book of the Old. He went to the only person who could help him frame this argument in the language of faith, Sister Livia Corden, the archivist nun of the Most Holy Cathedral. He didn't know that Mordant had sent her to spy on him 2 weeks earlier. Livia came to the workshop every day, quiet, unobtrusive, in a gray hooded habit. She introduced herself as a scribe interested in natural philosophy. She asked for permission to observe and take notes. Dan granted it. She asked good questions, precise, profound. Why does copper conduct electricity but wood does not? Why does a thread glow but a wire does not? Why does a battery lose its charge over time? Dan answered honestly, not because he trusted her, because good questions deserve honest answers. Over the course of 2 weeks of observation, Livia filled a notebook. Every evening she returned to the cathedral and was supposed to hand over her notes to Mordaunt. The first week she handed them over. The second week she began editing them. She removed phrases that could be interpreted as heresy. She left only what was safe. By the third week she stopped handing them over altogether, because every one of Dan's answers presented her with a question to which her faith had no answer. But Dan had one, and his answer didn't contradict the faith, it complemented it. Livia was sent to a convent at the age of 8. She didn't choose the faith chose her. For 20 years she transcribed manuscripts and studied dead languages, believing that the world was simple. There is a heavenly Father, there are his gifts, there is his punishment. Lightning is his finger, fire is purification, darkness is a trial. And then a stranger came and showed her that lightning isn't his finger. Lightning is an electrical discharge, predictable, controllable, and no less amazing for it. Dan came to her 5 days before the trial. He said he needed help, not with physics, with theology. Livia looked at him in silence. Then she pulled a notebook from under her cassock. She opened it to the last page. There was written the indictment that Mordaunt had asked her to draft, detailed, with quotes from sacred texts, with logic that led straight to the stake. Dan read it. He looked up at Livia. Livia took the notebook. She tore out the last page. She ripped it into tiny pieces. And she said she was no longer Mordaunt's spy. She didn't know who she was now, but she knew that what was written on that page was a lie, and she refused to rewrite a lie. Dan didn't show any surprise, although he was surprised. He asked if she would help him prepare his defense. Livia said she would help, but on one condition. He would tell her the truth, the whole truth, who he was, where he was from, how he did what he did. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he began to speak. He told her everything. Another world, the 21st century, electricity in every home, horseless carriages, light at the push of a button, voices coming from thin plates, millions of people living in cities of glass and steel. Livia listened for 3 hours. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cross herself. She didn't faint. She took notes, in 7 languages, using a code known only to her. When he finished, she closed her notebook. She looked at him, and she said that his story was either the greatest revelation or the greatest madness, and that in either case, Mordaunt was right about one thing. Dan was dangerous, but not because he brought evil. Rather, because he brought knowledge, and knowledge changes the world, and those who control the old world will fight back. They worked together for 5 days. Livia translated physics into the language of theology. Electricity is not a demon. Electricity is the breath that the Heavenly Father breathed into copper. Dan didn't summon it. He learned to hear it. A lamp is not a captive fire. A lamp is a window through which the hidden warmth of the world can be seen. Lightning is not punishment. Lightning is the Father's voice, and if a person has learned to hear that voice, it is not a sin. It is prayer. Every argument was structured so that the canonist could not object without calling the sacred texts into question. Every quotation was selected by Livia from the canon. Every word was checked for ambiguity. It was a work of engineering. Only instead of wires and circuits, they worked with words and meanings. Dan looked at Livia and thought that this quiet woman in a gray habit mastered words just as Hannah mastered circuits. Precisely, flawlessly, on the first try. On the morning of the 6th day, Dan woke up and looked out the window. The square in front of the cathedral was already filled with people. They had come for the trial. Some were waiting for a miracle. Some were waiting for the stake. Dan put on his blue jacket. He slipped the multimeter into his pocket. He grabbed the canvas bag of materials from the workbench. A strip of copper, a strip of iron, a jug of vinegar, a coil of wire, a glass bulb, a carbon filament. Everything he needed to assemble a light bulb from scratch in front of thousands of people. He stepped out onto the square. Hana was standing at the edge of the crowd. Mide was next to her. Iris was a little further away, wearing a hood. Jormar stood by the wall with a hammer. Livia, in her cassock, stood at the steps of the cathedral. Taya, the little grubby girl whom Dan had taken in a month ago when she tried to steal a coil of wire from him, stood in the front row and stared at him without blinking. She clutched a small flashlight with a hand-crank dynamo that Dan had made for her so she wouldn't be afraid of the dark. Dan looked at his people, then at the steps of the cathedral. Mordaunt was already seated in his chair. 12 cannons flanked him on either side. The crowd was buzzing. Soldiers maintained the perimeter. The trial began. The square was buzzing. 1,000 people, maybe more. Dan stood in front of the cathedral steps and looked at Mordaunt. The archpriest sat in a dark wooden chair, tall, thin, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from stone. His eyes were calm. His hands were folded in his lap. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who sincerely believed he was doing the right thing. And that made him more terrifying than any villain. Mordaunt raised his hand. The square fell silent. He began to speak. His voice was steady, low, without shouting, without grandstanding. He spoke of order, about how the world rests on 3 pillars: the Heavenly Father, His law, and His servants. The stranger had violated all 3. He had invoked a power that did not come from the Father. He had called it a craft rather than a gift. He had assumed the right to dispense light. But the light belongs to the Heavenly Father, and only the council decides who is worthy to receive it. Dan listened and counted the votes. 5 cannons nodded at every word Mordaunt spoke. 3 sat motionless, their faces inscrutable. 4, who were undecided, exchanged glances. Those 4 would decide everything. Mordaunt finished. He turned to Dan and nodded. Speak. Dan set his canvas bag on the stone pedestal in front of him. He opened it. He took out a strip of copper. He raised it above his head so the entire square could see it. He said it was copper. Ordinary copper. The kind used to make cauldrons, rings, and horseshoes. Every blacksmith in town works with it every day. Nothing sacred, nothing cursed. Just metal. He took out an iron strip. Iron. The kind used to make swords, nails, and horseshoes. Nothing special either. He took out a jug of vinegar. Sour wine. Used to clean dishes and marinate meat. Every housewife in town has a jug like this in her kitchen. He dipped the copper and iron strips into the vinegar. He set the bowl on the side table. He turned to the crowd. He said that now the copper would begin to breathe, not because he was a sorcerer, but because that's how the world works. Copper and iron in acid give rise to breath. It's inherent in the nature of things, just as water flows downward, just as fire rises upward, just as a stone falls when released. The Heavenly Father created the world with laws, and the breath of copper is one of those laws. Hidden, silent, but real. He took out a coil of wire. He wound 30 turns around a nail. He connected the ends to the strips in the bowl. He held a handful of iron filings up to the nail. The filings stuck to the nail. The crowd gasped. One of the wavering cannons stepped forward. Dan continued. He took out a glass flask, a carbon filament, copper whiskers. He assembled the lamp right there in the square. Every step spoken aloud. Every action was in plain sight. The filament went inside. The wicks went outside. He pumped out the air, sealed it, connected it. The carbon filament flared orange. Light flooded the pedestal and the nearest rows of the crowd. People recoiled. Then they moved closer. The lamp burned, steadily. No fire, no oil, no candle. Just copper and iron and sour wine and glass and coal. Things found in every home. Dan turned to the canons. He said that every person in this square could repeat what he had just done. It's not a gift, not a curse, not secret knowledge. It's a craft. Like blacksmithing, like weaving, like baking bread. It can be learned. It can be taught. And he is ready to teach anyone. Then he spoke the words Livia had prepared. The Heavenly Father breathed life into the copper not so that it might remain hidden. A hidden gift is no gift at all. It is a trial. The Father was waiting for someone to discover it. And if the council declares this breath a sin, then the council will declare a part of the divine plan a sin. The 4 wavering canons exchanged glances. One of them raised his hand and asked to speak. He asked if he could try it himself. Dan handed him the materials. The canon approached the pedestal. The crowd fell silent. An old priest in a brocade cassock stood before a bowl of vinegar and copper strips. Dan explained, step by step. The canon repeated the instructions. His hands trembled. But when he wound the wire around the nail, connected the ends, and sawdust began to crawl toward the metal, his expression changed. He took a step back. He looked at his hands, then at Dan, then at Mordaunt, and said he felt no evil in this, only surprise. The vote was quick, 7-5, in Dan's favor. 4 undecided and 3 independents voted for innocence. 5 loyal to Mordaunt voted for guilt. He was 2 votes short. Dan was free. The crowd roared. Someone was shouting his name. Someone was chanting, "Master Thunder!" Hannah pushed her way through the crowd and stood next to him. Mireille stood a little farther away and smiled. Iris, wearing her hood, applauded. Jormar, standing by the wall, raised his hammer above his head. Thea, in the front row, clutched her flashlight and smiled so widely it looked as if her face would crack. Mordaunt stood up. He looked at Dan. Their eyes met. The archpriest didn't look angry. He looked tired. He turned and walked into the cathedral. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Dan knew this wasn't the end. Mordaunt had lost in public. That meant the next blow would be private, secret, dangerous. But today they had won. Today, the lamp was burning in the square in front of the cathedral, and 1,000 people had seen that light could be made with their own hands. After the trial, Dan received 3 months of silence. Mordaunt left into shadow and remained silent. Not sermons against the Master Thunder, no quiet brothers, knee buying copper. Silence frightened more than open war. But Dan worked on every day. The hydroelectric power plant project was moving forward. The Queen had allocated a plot of land at a river rapids 2 kilometers upstream from the city. Stone for the dam was hauled in from the nearest quarry. Dan hired masons, 30 of them. He explained that they needed a wall across the river. Not very high, 4 meters, but sturdy, with a water channel and a chamber for the machine. The masons didn't ask any questions. They were paid twice as much as usual. Royal gold. The workshop had grown to 40 people. Dan could no longer manage on his own. He appointed foremen. Hannah was in charge of assembly and calculations. Mireille handled glass, insulation, and chemistry. Court was in charge of wire pulling. Yormar handled metalworking. Tom was in charge of testing. Iris, who came in every day and was getting better and better at soldering, was assigned to the fine soldering section, contacts and terminals. It was work that required precise fingers and patience. She had both. Livia sat in a corner of the workshop at a separate table and wrote. Dan dictated to her in the evenings. The basics of electrical engineering. What current is, what voltage is, what resistance is, what power is. He gave her the formulas without letters, just in words. Breathing force equals breathing pressure multiplied by breathing flow. Power equals voltage multiplied by current. Livia wrote it down in 3 languages, the local language, the Latin she knew, and a strange cipher she'd invented herself in case the notebook fell into the wrong hands. It was the first textbook on electrical engineering in the history of this world. Taya now lived next to the workshop. Dan had set aside a corner for her with a cot and a blanket. She didn't talk, almost never, but she drew, with charcoal on the walls, on boards, on scraps of parchment. She drew the diagrams she'd seen in the workshop, and she drew them more precisely than Dan did. Every line in its place, every coil of the spool, every connection. He gave her blank boards and charcoal, and she copied the drawings with a precision that took his breath away. One night, he found a drawing on the wall above her cot, his face, in profile, leaning over the workbench, his hands on the wires, the light from the lamp above. The portrait was alive, not technical, alive. She had drawn him just as she saw him, focused, tired, real. Dan stood in front of that drawing and felt something tighten in his throat. He has no children. He never had any on Earth either. The divorce happened because his wife wanted a family, and he wanted to lay high-voltage lines through the mountains. He chose the wires. And now a 14-year-old orphan who doesn't know her own name is drawing his portrait in charcoal and sleeping with a flashlight clutched in her arms. Winter in Veldania was long and dark. 14 hours of night, sometimes 16. The ashen haze in the sky thickened, and the sun set even earlier. People lived in semi-darkness from October through March. But this year, the main street of Kirvalon was lit up. 20 streetlights, from the market square to the palace gates. Dan had installed them in a week. Wires ran from the mill's generator across the rooftops. Each streetlight had a copper housing with a rain visor. Each stood on a 3-meter-high iron pole. The lights came on at sunset. It went out at dawn. Hannah monitored the generator. She had learned to sense its hum and determine the load by ear. If the hum changed, it meant there was a problem somewhere along the line. A burned-out bulb, a broken wire, a wet insulator. She would dispatch a repair crew of 2 apprentices with spare parts. The system worked. Not perfectly. It had its glitches. It had its breakdowns. Something broke once a week. But it worked. And every evening, the main street of Kirvalon was bathed in warm orange light. People were changing. The laundress from the lower street now worked until midnight. She wove by lamplight and, in 3 months, paid off a debt that had weighed on her for 7 years. The baker by the market set the dough out in the evening and baked bread at night. In the morning, his bread was the freshest in town. The weaver from the alley embroidered delicate patterns that had been impossible to do by candlelight. The jeweler could finally see the color of the stones. The old gatekeeper, for the first time in 20 years, wasn't afraid of the night shift. Dan watched all this and thought. Not about the generators, not about the wires, about people. Every lamp changed someone's life. Not in the abstract, specifically. This person, this job, this duty, this embroidery. He wasn't just creating light. He was creating opportunity. The opportunity to live after sunset. By spring, The dam at the river rapids was half finished. The generator for the Yormar station had been under construction for 3 months already. Huge, 5 times larger than a mill's. The copper coil weighed 80 kilograms. Dan ordered the magnets from the southern mines. Natural magnetic iron ore. Heavy, powerful. 12 blocks, 5 kilograms each. He designed the turbine himself. A water wheel wouldn't work on this scale. An axial turbine was needed. The water flow hits the blades at an angle and turns the shaft. Simple in theory, devilishly complicated in practice. Every blade had to be perfectly shaped. Every angle was calculated. The slightest error and the vibration would destroy the bearings within a week. Hannah calculated the angles. Livia wrote down the formulas. Yormar forged the blades. Dan inspected each one personally. The work progressed slowly, but it progressed. By summer, the turbine was assembled. 200 kilograms of iron and steel, 4 meters in diameter. It was waiting for water. Summer brought 2 things: water into the turbine and war on the horizon. The dam was completed in midsummer, a stone wall across the river, 4 meters high and 20 meters wide, with a 2-meter-wide channel through which water fell onto the turbine blades. Dan stood on the bank and watched as the workers raised the last gate. Water gushed into the channel. It struck the blades. The turbine shuddered. It screeched, and it began to spin. Slowly, then faster, then smoothly and powerfully. A rumble filled the river valley. The turbine shaft, via a belt drive, turned the generator rotor. A copper coil spun between the magnets. Dan connected the multimeter. The needle crept to the right, past 20, past 50, past 100. It stopped at 120. 120 volts. Stable. Clean. Powerful. Kana stood nearby, watching the meter. She didn't know the numbers on the meter, but she knew Dan's face. He wasn't smiling. He stood motionless, listening to the hum. That very same hum. The one he'd heard thousands of times in the mountains of California. At substations, by the transformers. The hum of current in the wires. Only now, this current was born from a river that flowed beneath 2 moons in a world without electricity. He had created it. From scratch. From stone and copper and iron and the knowledge he carried in his head. Hannah touched his elbow and asked if everything was all right. Dan nodded. Then he said quietly, to himself, not to her, "Dad, if you can see me, I did become an electrician after all. Just like you wanted." Hannah didn't understand. She didn't know who his father was. She didn't know that Dan's father had been an electrician in Sacramento and had dreamed that his son would follow in his footsteps, and that Dan had, and that his father had died of cancer 2 years before Dan was killed at the substation, and that Dan never got the chance to tell him he'd been right. It took 3 weeks to run the wires from the substation to the city, a thick copper cable with leather insulation, 2 kilometers, on poles, across fields, through the suburbs, to the main substation by the market square. Dan built the substation in a stone building that used to be a warehouse, a transformer, a distribution panel, fuses made of thin wire that blow when overloaded and save the line. Grounding. 3 copper rods driven 2 meters into the ground. Everything by the book. His book, which he knew by heart because he'd taken the exam 12 years ago and hadn't forgotten a single line since. From the substation, the wires branched out into the streets. 200 streetlights, all over Kiev alone. From the harbor to the palace, from the market to the city gates. Yormar forged every streetlight himself. Mireille blew every glass shade herself. Han checked every connection herself. Court and Tom installed every pole themselves. It was a collective effort. 100 hands. One plan. Dan's plan. The launch was scheduled for the first day of winter. Celestina insisted. She wanted it to be a celebration, a symbol, a statement. Light arriving on the longest night of the year. But a month before the launch, news came from the east. The Varkad Empire had crossed the border. 3 armies, 20,000 soldiers, fire priests leading each column. Their magic was simple and devastating. Fire. Pure, controlled fire. The walls burned. The gates burned. People burned. 2 border duchies fell within a week. The third held out, but it was only a matter of days. The capital was preparing for a siege. Celestina had declared a mobilization. Every man between the ages of 16 and 50 was to take his place on the walls. Dan stood at the substation, looking at the map Mireille had brought. The Varkad army was advancing along the Royal Highway. In 2 weeks, it would be at the walls of Kiev alone. His lamps wouldn't stop the army. His wires wouldn't kill the fire priests. Or maybe they would. Or maybe they wouldn't. He looked at the map and didn't see roads or rivers. He saw a diagram. The city walls were the outline. The gates were the entry points. The fire priests were energy sources. His station was also an energy source, just a different kind. He began to sketch. Lightning rods. Dozens of lightning rods along the perimeter of the walls. Tall iron spikes connected by copper cable to storage units. The storage units were capacitor-type batteries, glass jars lined with copper foil inside and out. Leyden jars, the simplest of capacitors. Hundreds of them, charged to their maximum capacity by the station. And the discharge devices, copper rods pointing outward toward the advancing army. When the circuit closes, the entire stored charge strikes a single point. Thousands of volts. Tens of thousands. Artificial lightning. Not 40 million volts like the real thing, but enough to knock a horse off its feet. To immobilize a man in iron armor. To set a siege tower ablaze. Kana looked at the drawing and said it was madness. Dan replied that this was the 4th time someone had said that, and that he was starting to take it as a compliment. Mireille looked at the blueprint and asked how many glass jars they'd need. Dan said 500. Mireille took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and went to the furnace. She had 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Dan had never in his Altum had work like that. Not even after the hurricanes in California, when the crew was restoring the lines along 18 hours a day. Here, it was worse. That's that from these 2 weeks depended not wires, life. The workshop turned into a military factory. 40 people worked at 2 shifts. Mireille was blowing Leyden jars. Glass vessels were up to elbow. Inside, copper foil. On the outside, copper foil. Between them is glass. The simplest capacitor. Each stores a charge like a bucket holds water. 1 jar is small. 500 connected in parallel is a shock from which the horse Yormar forged lightning rods. Iron pins were in 2 meters, sharp, made copper tips for better contact. 70 pieces, per 1 for each prong of the wall. Court and Tom were pulling the cable along the walls, a thick one, in triple insulation. Every meter has been tested. Every joint is filled with resin. A single spark in the wrong place, and the circuit is dead. Hannah coordinated the installation. She stood against the wall with a drawing in his, and shouted commands. 1-1 is ready. Section 2. Check contact on the 3rd insulator. Section 3. Cable is sagging. Pull it tight. Her voice echoed over the walls, and the soldiers who did not understand what was obeyed, because that in her voice there was something that they understood. Confidence. Iris was working with fine soldering, contacts of the arresters, copper rods which guided the discharge to the desired point. Each must be able to withstand thousands of volts in a fraction of a second. One bad solder joint, and the rod would melt at the very first discharge. Iris soldered 16 hours a day. Her fingers were scorched. Her eyes were red. Dresses were a thing of the past. She worked in a canvas apron and leather gloves, and looked happier than she had ever been in her life. Livia wrote instructions for the soldiers, how to handle the dischargers, in simple words, with pictures drawn by Thea. The little girl sat next to Livia and drew diagrams. A little man stands by the lever. The arrow points down. The lever is down. Lightning shoots from the rod. The enemy falls. Simple. Clear. Even an illiterate soldier would understand. Dan checked every component of the system personally. Every lightning rod, every capacitor, every discharge device, every meter of cable. He slept 2 hours a day. Mireille brought him food and made him eat. One night, she found him asleep with his face pressed against the blueprint. She tucked a rolled-up apron under his head and covered him with a blanket. Then she stood nearby and watched him. His face was soot-stained. His hands were scorched, calluses upon calluses. He wasn't handsome. He was real. She whispered that she didn't know who he was, but that she was his. Dan didn't hear her. He was asleep. The Varkad army reached the walls on the 14th day. Night. The torches of the enemy camp dotted the plain like stars fallen to the ground. 20,000 soldiers, siege towers, battering rams, and at the center of the camp, the tent of the fire priests. A red light pulsed inside. Their magic glowed like embers before the strike. Dan stood on the wall at the main control panel, a wooden shield with 12 levers. Each lever controlled a section of discharge units, 12 sections, 50 capacitors in each. Next to it was an ammeter cobbled together from whatever was at hand. The needle was at 0. The capacitors were charged. The system was waiting. Kana stood by the eastern perimeter, Court by the western one, Tom by the southern one. Iris was at the northern perimeter. Myri was in the infirmary with her lamps. Livia was giving instructions to the soldiers. Yormar stood below at the gate with a hammer. Thea sat in the workshop basement, clutching a flashlight. Dan told her to hide. She nodded. She didn't cry. She just nodded and left. The assault began at dawn. The siege towers crept toward the walls. The battering rams advanced toward the gates. The fire priests emerged from the tent. 5 of them, in red robes, with hands glowing with heat. The first priest raised his palms, and a pillar of flame struck the wall. The stone turned red. It crackled. The soldiers on the wall recoiled from the heat. Dan waited. The towers drew closer. 100 meters. 50. 30. They entered the blast zone. Dan placed his hands on the levers. His voice was steady, just as steady as when he'd given orders to his brigade in California, with burning trees crackling beneath his feet and severed wires humming overhead. Section 1. Discharge. He lowered the first lever. The capacitors closed onto the discharge electrodes. Thousands of volts surged through the copper rods into the nearest siege tower. A flash. A crash. The tower shook. The wood began to smoke. The horses harnessed to it reared up. The soldiers inside fell on top of one another. Section 3. Discharge. The second tower took the hit. The iron rings on its walls glowed red hot. A soldier, clinging to the railing, yanked his hands away with a scream. Section 5. Hold the charge. Kana, monitor the voltage on the eastern circuit. Kana's voice from the eastern wall. Voltage is stable, boss. The fire priests saw the discharges and stopped. They knew fire, they knew heat, but they didn't know lightning. Lightning was beyond their understanding, beyond their magic. Fire burns, lightning strikes. They are different things. The high priest raised both hands. A torrent of flame struck the wall with triple the force. Stones burst from the heat. Dan saw a crack in the wall. If the priest continued, the wall would collapse in a minute. Section 7. Maximum discharge. Aim at the priest. 3 levers down simultaneously. 150 capacitors discharged into a single point. The discharge struck the ground in front of the priest. The flash blinded everyone within a 50-meter radius. The roar was like a clap of thunder. The ground beneath the priest's feet exploded in a fountain of clay and stones. He was thrown back 10 meters. His robe was smoldering. He was alive, but his flame had gone out. For the first time in his life, the fire priest Varkada stood in darkness, without fire, without power. The 4 remaining priests looked at him, then at the walls, then at each other, and they ran. The army faltered. As the priests fled, the soldiers lost their faith. Without fire magic, they were merely men in armor facing walls that struck with lightning. The assault faltered by noon. By evening, the army had retreated. By nightfall, the plain before Kirvalone was empty. Only the abandoned towers smoldered in the darkness. Dan stood at the control panel. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from tension. 12 hours on his feet, hundreds of decisions per minute. Every lever meant someone's life or death. He was an engineer. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who stood at the control panel with the levers and did his job, just as he'd done his whole life. Hana climbed up to him on the wall. She looked out at the empty plain, then at him, and said quietly, "We won, boss." Dan nodded. Then he sat down on the stones of the wall because his legs wouldn't hold him up. And he sat there until Mire came and took him to the infirmary. He fell asleep on a cot between a wounded soldier and a bandaged mason, and he slept for 16 hours. A week after the battle, the city celebrated. Dan did not celebrate. He was fixing it. 8 capacitors blew during discharge. 2 discharge tubes melted. 1 kilometer of cable on the south wall is needed to retape again. The insulation couldn't, and in 3 places the insulation to stone. The work wasn't wait. The war wasn't end with a single battle. But the empire did returned. The messengers brought news after 2 weeks. The Varkada retreated beyond the border. The fiery priests demanded explanations from their generals. As mere walls could strike lightning bolts, lightning is an element beyond fire. Their theology did not allow such a thing. So either their gods are weaker than they thought, or behind the walls of Kirvalona stood a god whose they did not know. In any case, to fight with lightning, they didn't. The world was shaky, fragile, but it was, and Dan used every more of his day. Launch the Street took place a month after the battle, the first day of winter as Brace and Celestina, the longest night of the year. Dan stood at the substation by river, his hand at the main circuit breaker. Copper lever is cold under my fingers. All around it are Hana's a distribution panel, Myre with spare test tubes in a canvas bag, Court and Tom on the line, ready for repair if something goes right. Iris on the roof of the nearest house with a signal lantern to signal a signal if the lamp on high in the street won't light up. Libya with a notebook was writing down every detail for the textbook. Jormar stood by the door of the substation, without hammer, with arms crossed across chest. He was smiling, for the first time in a long time. Taya stood beside with him, the flashlight on his belt, coal behind ear. She looked at Dan and waited. At Main Street, from the market square to the palace gates, stood people. Hundreds. Thousands. They had come to see the light. Queen Celestina stood on the balcony of the palace. Her young king clung against her. She held him by shoulders. Mordaunt looked out the window of the cathedral. His face was in shadow. Dan flipped the circuit breaker. The current rushed through the wires, from station along cable across the fields, through the outskirts, to substation, from the substation along the streets, to streetlights. The first streetlight flared up at the market square, then a second one, third, fifth, the 10th, one after one in a cascade. A wave of light that flowed along the main street of Caervallone from the market to the palace. 200 lanterns. From that night at the first snow. Heavy, soft, white. Snowflakes fell into the light of the Carda and sparkled with gold. The street turned into a river of golden snow. The crowd froze. Silence hung so that you could hear a hum of puzzo in wires. Then the child in the first row laughed and ran between the poles, catching snowflakes in the light. Behind him, the second, a third. A dozen children were running down the street and laughing, and the snow swirled in the light and fell into on heads golden dust. The old man by the wall began to cry. He had lived 70 years in this city, and for the first time saw my street at night. All of it. From one end to the edge, every paving stone, every door, every face. The laundromat was at the threshold of her house and looked at the light. She didn't cry. She was smiling. That's that she knew that tonight, I'd be no. And tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and every night until the end of life, the light any more will end. The queen on the balcony held her son to herself and looked at the street. The boy was pointing with his heart at streetlights and counted. 1, 2, 3. He lost in 30 and began from the beginning. Mordaunt stood by the cathedral window. He looked at the light, at the people in that light, at the children who were running and laughing, at the old people who were crying, at the women who were smiling. He realized he had lost, not to Dan, to the light. You can't defeat what makes people happy. You can delay it. You can't stop it. He stepped away from the window and sat down at the table. Before him lay a parchment with a new indictment. He stared at it for a long time. Then he crumpled it up and threw it into the fire. Dan was standing at the substation. His face was blackened with soot. His hand was scorched, a multimeter in his pocket. He listened to the hum of current in the wires and looked out at the street bathed in light, at the golden snow, at the children running, at his people. Hannah stood by the control panel, watching the gauges. Her wooden tag swayed around her neck. Mireille stood next to him, silently, shoulder to shoulder. Her glasses reflected the light of 200 street lamps. Iris on the roof raised a signal lantern. All the lamps were lit, every single one. Livia was writing in her notebook. The first day of winter. 200 street lamps. Caervallone. Jormar looked at the light, and his old, failing eyes saw what they hadn't seen before. His street. His city. His world. Bathed in light that had been born in his forge a year ago, from a piece of copper wire and sour wine. Taya ran out from behind Jormar's back. She ran across the square. She ran up the steps to the substation's porch and took Dan by the hand, a small, dirty hand in his large, scorched palm. Hannah followed Taya. She stood beside her. Behind Hannah was Mire. Behind Mire was Iris. Behind Iris was Livia. They stood on the porch of the substation and looked at their city in the light they had created, all together. The crowd in the square began to chant, "Thunder, thunder, thunder." Dan listened. Then he shook his head. He turned to Hannah and asked her to hand him the carbon microphone he'd assembled a month ago. Hannah brought it to him. Dan plugged it into the amplifier at the substation. He stood on the porch. The square fell silent. He said he wasn't a god. His name was Daniel Hunter. He was an electrician. He had come from a place very far away where there were millions like him. He knew how to make light, and he would teach them. Anyone who wanted to learn. The first lesson would be tomorrow at dawn by the mill. Come with clean hands and an open mind. That's all you need. The crowd was silent. Snow was falling. The streetlights were on. Then Taya squeezed his hand tighter. She opened her mouth and spoke a word. The first word Dan had ever heard from her. Quiet. Hoarse. Hesitant. She said, "Father." Dan looked at her, a little grubby girl with a flashlight on her belt and a piece of coal behind her ear, who doesn't know her own name, whom he found when she was stealing wire from him, who draws his portrait on the wall every night, who sleeps hugging her flashlight because she's afraid of the dark. He dropped to one knee. He cupped her face in his hands, the electrician's rough, sunburnt hands, and nodded. The next morning, 37 people came to the mill. Farmers, apprentices, 2 soldiers, a laundress, a priest. Dan stood before them with a piece of chalk and a wooden board. He wrote 3 words on the board: current, voltage, resistance, and began the first lesson. A year later, the Wallen Academy admitted 120 students. 2 years later, his graduates were laying wires in neighboring towns. 3 years later, Livia Corden's first textbook was printed on a printing press that Dan had built in his spare time and sold in a print run of 500 copies. The cover bore the name Daniel Hunter, Electrician. One autumn, when the trees along the river turned golden, Dan descended into an old mine beneath an abandoned monastery. He was looking for copper deposits. He found something else. In a distant tunnel blocked with rocks lay debris, iron pipes, rivets, and the remains of a boiler, and a leather-bound diary. The handwriting was small and neat, written in English. The date on the first page? March 1847. The author's name? Thomas Whately, Manchester, steam engineer. Dan read the diary by the light of his lantern and recognized himself in every line. Another world, a foreign language, misunderstanding, fear, loneliness, and a stubborn engineer's desire to build, to repair, to make it work. Whately was building a steam locomotive. He almost succeeded, but he miscalculated the pressure in the boiler. The explosion ignited the coal seam. The fire spread deep underground, a volcanic chain reaction. Ash rose into the sky and remained there, a veil of ash that shrouded Veldania for a century. Not a volcanic eruption, an engineer's mistake. Dan closed the diary. He put it in his bag. He left the mine. He stood at the edge and looked up at the sky. The ash cloud hung over the world like a reminder. He wasn't the first. Thomas Whately came before him. Someone else might have come before Whately. The world remembers the outsiders as gods and as devils, but it forgets them as people. Dan decided that something else would remain after him. Not ashes, not a legend. A textbook, with his real name on the cover. And a school, where a boy from the village could become an electrician just as easily as he now becomes a carpenter. He returned to Caervalone. Evening was falling. The streetlights came on one by one. A golden light flooded the streets. Taya ran to meet him. A flashlight bounced on her belt. Behind her came Hana, holding a ledger. Behind Hana came Myre, his people, his workshop, his town, his world. Dan smiled. He took off his work gloves. He took Taya by the hand, and he walked home.